So let's pick up somewhere in the neighborhood of where we left off. I added just a little bit of CSS to this thing. Now, to get this, I only made very, very slight changes to my markup. I changed the HTML as little as possible to get this effect. What did I do? Let's see. In my HTML, all I did was I put the H1 inside a header element, which could have just been a div. So header is one of those HTML5 elements that was added. That just gives a little more semantic meaning to elements, because divs are meaningless, right? If you have an element that describes something's purpose on a page, that's good structurally. We should use those if we have them. So it added quite a few, like header, aside, footer, main, section, article, stuff like that. They all just behave exactly like divs, but it lets you add a little more meaning to your markup. So I like to use those when I can. So I added a header around there, and then I threw in an H2 underneath it that said a whole mess of Chris's. And then the only other change I made to the HTML was to actually add a single image to it, which was the little black line thingy. So let me see here. Where did I put these things? There we go. So I'll find my project folder. I can do it in this case by right-clicking on a file, saying Reveal in Finder or Reveal in Explorer on Windows. It'll open up my folder here. And so I'm going to copy my two images. The one with the eyeballs, which is called chris.jpg, and then decoration.ping. I will drop these in Slack as well. Session 3 morning, here we go. So if you do want yours to look like mine, I am dropping those photos in Slack. So I have chris.jpg, decoration.ping. But again, the only change I actually made in my markup was to add an image for the decoration. So that's an IMG, and like input, that is an empty element. There's no closing tag. So image, IMG. Source, you give it the path to the image. The image is called decoration.ping. The alt attribute, which should not be considered optional, is what will appear if the image doesn't load for whatever reason, or if you're using assistive technology like a screen reader. You can leave it blank like this, but you must have it present. So if you leave it blank, in this case, like it's not actually conveying any information. It's purely decorative, so I'm going to leave it blank. It's not like someone would be missing important information if it weren't there. If, for example, you had a button that did something when you clicked it, and it was like an image of text. Don't use text as images if you possibly can avoid it. But if you did, you would need that text to be there if the image didn't load for whatever reason. So if you had a picture of words and someone couldn't see the picture, they would need the words, right? So you would use the alt attribute to say that. But in this case, not necessary, purely decorative. So there it is. Let's see how this looks. It's not going to look like much. Yeah, in fact, that looks kind of terrible. So we're going to have to style that with some CSS. But that's all in the world I did to my HTML. That's the only difference between this and this. HTML-wise, they're exactly the same. Oh, sorry, I made one more change. The input and the button inside the form, I wrapped them inside an inner div. So there's a div inside the form around those two elements. That's it. That's the only other change I made. And in fact, that isn't going to make any difference to the appearance here. But it gives me another thing that I can target with style. And in the old HTML spec, it was actually illegal to put an input directly inside a form. You needed another block level element between them, either a paragraph or a div or something like that. I don't know why, but that was in the HTML4 spec that was required, but not anymore. It was always kind of silly. And boy, it is really not wanting to upload my images to Slack. What the heck, man? They're not even that big. Huh. Maybe it's a firewall issue. We'll get them eventually. We can get them over the break if nothing else. So the rest of the difference in between that and this is all CSS. And this is not a CSS class, and we're not going to go in excruciating detail over CSS. If you're interested in learning, there are a lot of resources out there, and I encourage you to do so. And you can make yours look fancy, like our friends who showed off their work today. Like, see if I can remember who all showed their work. So Ashley and Evelyn and Cheng and Eli and Matt. Is that everybody? Cool. You can make yours look like theirs if you learn the magical world of CSS. So let's see. Let's start heading in that direction. First of all, I added a new font. So I totally just went through Google Fonts and looked for another one that looked kind of groovy. That looks terrible. Refresh. Here we go. So I narrowed it down to just display fonts and handwriting fonts. I zoomed out quite a bit so I could see a lot at once. And eventually I found another one that I liked, which was Parisien. So here at the top. What happened when I chose that other font, then it gave me a URL that looked like this. And that added a second font for my Google Fonts download. And then I just made it so that the H1 was styled with that font. H1, font family. Parisien. Mais oui. We'll have it fall back to any cursive font it can find. So if I just do that, that's not going to make a whole lot of difference, but there we go. So I did that. Then, because I'm weird, I went ahead and made myself a background image. So I fired up Photoshop and made sure their eyeballs, the pupils, were all perfectly aligned. I had to on Hemsworth and Pine there. They were a little off axis, so I had to rotate them a little bit, nudge them up and down, resize them just right. Make sure that we were very precisely in quarters here. We don't want to show favoritism by giving more pixels to somebody than someone else. Yeah, got to have that kind of attention to detail if you're weird. I mean, if you want to do a good job. Get our white borders just so. So, like I said, this is not an image that I added to the HTML. Instead, it is simply a background image on this header element. So I added this header, which gives me another thing that I can target. So I set header here. So we get, these are just selectors, right? Just like in query selector, you target them with CSS the same way. So header, body, H1, just CSS selectors. So the header, I gave a background image. So CSS in general, you have a selector followed by curly braces. Inside the curly braces, you have a set of properties and values. The properties, if they're multiple words, always have dashes or hyphens in between, and they always end in a semicolon. The semicolons are not optional. This is not JavaScript. So background image, the value is URL parentheses something, semicolon, and it is simply the path to the image, and I put the image right here in the same folder, chris.jpg. So chris.jpg, have a look at that. That looks absolutely terrifying. So, if you want to fiddle around with this and figure out what your CSS should be instead of just bouncing back and forth and hitting refresh a million times. Because by default, they're going to tile. They're going to tile by default. So, yeah. So we can inspect this and fiddle with the CSS until we get what we want. So one thing I want, let's see here. Let's fiddle with my header style. I should probably make this a tad bigger. There we go. Let's see. So background size, cover, I think is what I want. But I don't want that. So I should probably make sure that the height, so the way cover works, let's see, does it just happen to tell me? Let's actually do it here. Background size. So I don't remember if this is through an extension or not that it tells me the documentation right here in line. Specifies the size of the background images. It even tells me which browsers it works in. I'm pretty sure this is an extension called Can I Use, but I'm not entirely sure about that. And then the possible values, if I say cut contain, will scale the image while preserving its intrinsic aspect ratio to the largest size such that its width and height can fit inside the background positioning area. Cover does it to the smallest size such that the entire image fills in, which is what I want. So I'm going to say cover, but as we saw, that isn't enough. That still looks terrible. So what I want to do is make sure that the height is the right value for this to be just exactly what I'm looking for. So I'm going to fiddle with that. So again, I'm kind of flying through the CSS because if you are interested, I want you to have some idea how I did this stuff, but it's not the primary purpose of the class, so I'm going to kind of go fast. So as far as the kind of units you can use for sizes of things, there's good old pixels, of course. I tend to avoid pixels when I can because people resize their windows and stuff, and they're not going to end up being actual pixels. So I tend to use one relative size or another. I either tend to do rim, which is relative to the default font size to the page, or percentages, or sometimes VW, which is view width, relative to the width of the window, which I sometimes like for the sake of just making it relative to the size of the window, which I think is what I'm going to use here. And I fiddled around some. I actually got pretty close on my first guess here, but let's say 13 VW. Let's say height. That's what I'm actually trying to fiddle with here. Let's say 13 VW. Okay, we don't quite see enough of pine there. We could try 12. We could try 11. There. That looks about right. If I went any smaller, that's too much on the right. What do we think? 10 actually shows more of the image. But I think I like the way 11 ends up getting cropped. But then we don't get it's not fair to pine. Whatever. 10 is probably the right value. Let's go with height 10 VW. And that's good enough. We could use some bottom margin on that, but we'll come back to that. So let's say height 10 VW. So what that means, 100 VW, that is the width of the window. So 10 is 10%. That's 1/10 of the window, of the width of the window. So now you'll notice, no matter how big I get exactly the same amount of that image. Everything is kind of relative to the size of the window, so I get exactly the right amount of the thing showing up here. So I've got some margin on the page itself that I don't really want there. So it looks like body has some margin by default just in the browser, so I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to put margin 0 on here. Do this in here just to see how it looks. Margin 0 doesn't totally get rid of it, and that's because the H1 has tons of margin around it, and I don't want that. So I've already got a rule here for my H1. I'll throw some margin 0 on there. And let's see how we're looking. All right, good. So now I need some white border around the sides here on my my header. So I'll do a little bit of that. So on my header, I'll give it a border of, it'll be solid white, and I'm going to say half of the default font size. I'm happy with that. Cool. Groovy, groovy. So our H1 here, we've got the right font, but it still kind of looks terrible. So let's fiddle with it a little bit. First of all, I want it to be centered. So let's do a little text align center. Okay, good. That's unreadable, that black on top of those images. So let's say color white. That's good, but white on white is not readable, so I'm going to put a little text shadow on it. And this is getting kind of fancy, but I put a little shadow on it. I put 2 shadows on it. So text shadow, if we look that up, Let's look up CSS text shadow. The text shadow property. A lot of times what you'll find if you look up CSS properties, W3 schools will be one of the first 3 results. Developer.mozilla.org, MDN is probably going to be one of the top ones. And CSS tricks is going to be one of the top ones. W3 schools is kind of cool. They document things pretty thoroughly, and they always give you a little place where you can try it yourself. So you can just like fiddle with the value and see how it changes it. Like what if we change this 2 pixels to 6 pixels and run it? Okay, you can see what that does, right? So that's kind of cool about that. I think CSS tricks tends to give the best explanation for how things work when the network is working well enough for the page to load. So I like CSS tricks. But I'm not going to belabor this too much. The values I ended up coming up with, I put 2 shadows on it. A red shadow and a green shadow to make it all Christmas-y. So you can look up what these different values mean. But this is the offset, the first 2 values. This is the blur, and this is obviously the color. So I did that, and I forgot to put my color white back in there. There we go. And then I also forgot to put my text align center back in there. There we go. And I didn't mean to put this on header. I meant to put it on H1. There we go. And that's not big enough. So I fiddled with the size a little bit, and what I ended up coming up with was, I'll put it up by font family. Font size, 15 VW, 15% of the width of the window. Scales nicely no matter how big or small I make it. I like the way that's sized and positioned relative to the eyeballs. Now, of course, everything else on the page is kind of in the wrong place relative to that. So I dealt with that by putting a little margin on the bottom of the header itself. Quite a bit of margin on the bottom of that. There we go. Now the form is way down here. So now I've got an H2 here too. So I styled that. I centered it. I moved it up the page a little because it put an awful lot of space for this just because of the nature of that font. It left way more room than we actually need. If you hover over something in the Elements tab over here, you can see how much space it's actually taking up. And that's more than we need for that. So I'm just going to offset that by putting some negative margin on the H2. And now it's centered and it's kind of small. And I unbolded the font because by default, all the headings are bold, or at least H1 and H2 are. And I don't want that, so I lowered the font weight. And then my little decorative image here is way too dang big. So I dealt with that too. And here's the first time we're using a different kind of selector that we haven't seen before. So header Space IMG. Anybody know what that means? To put a space between selectors like that? So the thing I'm actually targeting is the image. And what this selector says, and remember, you can use this in query selector too. It's the same selector syntax. This is called a descendant selector when you have a space between things. And what that means is an image that is inside the header. It is a descendant of the header on the tree. It doesn't have to be an immediate child. There could be something in between them. It just has to be inside there. So I target the image that way in case I put more images on the page later. I don't want this CSS rule to affect that. So I make it 80% of the width. I display it as a block because otherwise I can't put margins on it because images are inline by default. That is, they don't take up an entire line, right? They don't have a line break above, before and after by default, but I want them to in this case. There we go. Beautiful. Now the form itself doesn't look like much, so I styled the form too. I gave the actual form just a little bit of padding so it doesn't hug the left and right because there's no space at all on the left, which looks kind of bad. So now there's a little bit of space there. And then you may remember that I put the input and the button inside a div. The only real structure I added there. So when I did that, I styled that. So here I'm using something called Flexbox. If you're interested in CSS layout, Flexbox is an essential thing to learn. And again, CSS Tricks is one of the best resources for that. I highly recommend. Notice what their little search bar up here, Flexbox is like what they have as their placeholder. So yeah, search for Flexbox on there, and you get a complete guide to Flexbox, which is really cool. If you've been writing CSS for as long as I have, then Flexbox was just the best thing to ever happen to you, because trying to lay things out with CSS before that was just kind of an error-prone nightmare. Flexbox makes it way, way easier. And since then, there's grid layout in CSS, which is even more powerful yet. But I highly recommend you use this if you want to learn how to lay things out. So I'm using some Flexbox tricks that I won't get into too much here. I will say that one of the main things you do with Flexbox is you tell it what to do with any space that's left over once you've filled up the box that you're dealing with. So I set a line item stretch, which means that the things I put inside the form are going to stretch to fill the entire width. So any space that's left over, it's going to distribute evenly among the things that are inside there. So in this case, the input and the button. So this should make them spread out and fill up the whole thing to the width of the container, which is right now not very much. So you'll see there's some, it's not really doing what I want just yet. So first, I have to also style the input and the other thing. And I'll admit, I got a little carried away with the styles for the button and the input. So yeah. But that then made it look like this. So I won't, if you're interested in learning about how all these things work, you can obviously look up each of these things on CSS Tricks and learn how they work. Most of them are fairly straightforward, like, okay, height, min width, I can guess what that is, minimum width, right? And some of these other things, box sizing, border box, better look that up if you want to know what that means. Okay, I'll tell you. So if you have something highlighted here and you look down here, you can see how much of the space that it takes up is dedicated to margin, border, padding, and the actual element itself. Now, if you set the width of an element, how much of that would you think width includes? Would you think it's the whole thing? Would you think it's everything except the margin? Would you think it's just the element itself? Would you think element plus padding? What would you think intuitively? I don't know. I heard different answers. So, okay, I'll just tell you. When they finally standardized this, they decided that width referred to just the element. That was actually kind of a pain in the neck. The difference between padding and margin is that padding is inside the border. So sometimes it seems like when you say width, you mean everything except margin, because margin is kind of the space between elements. Padding is kind of inside the element. It pads it, but inside the border, so it seems like it's part of the element. But width only refers to that piece in there, which made certain layouts really, really hard to do, because it was basically impossible to account for the padding sometimes, depending on what you were trying to do. So what this property does, box sizing border box, it includes border and padding in the width. So if you specify the width, that's everything except the margin, which a lot of times is an easier thing to specify. For example, if you want to take up all of its container, you would say 100%. But then if you want to add some padding to it, well, that padding is going to be outside the container element, because the width itself is already taking up 100%. There's no room for any more padding, which is kind of unfortunate. You probably want the padding to be inside there. So if you use border box, that's what you get. So anyway, the rest of this, like I said, you can look up, but I will tell you that this flex thing here, I won't get into the details, but what I'm telling it here is, I said with Flexbox, one of the things you're doing is telling it what to do with the space that's left over. I'm saying any space that's left over after you've put the input and the button there, I want 4 times as much of that extra space to end up on the input as ends up on the button, because the input should really be bigger than the button. So first it's going to make them both take up how much space they need. Then anything that's left over is mostly going to go to the input. That's what that rule is doing. And then I'm getting fancy when it gets focused. So if you look here, watch it. Woo, 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 woo. See how it kind of, the little shadow kind of fades in and out. So that's what I'm doing there. I have a little hover effect on this thing too. So that's what's going on here. So here's my CSS. I'm going to throw this in Slack real quick, if Slack ever gives up on uploading my images. And here's my HTML, if you're interested in that. Questions? Style the page.